Harold Finn had always believed that every number had a story. To him, mathematics was not an abstract collection of symbols or equations. It was a language that whispered meaning about how the world moved, breathed, and stayed in balance. He saw geometry in the way the morning light hit the classroom windows, calculus in the slow bend of train tracks disappearing into fog, probability in the roll of dice on a bar counter, and symmetry in the pattern of human behavior. At one time, he was among the most promising mathematical minds of his generation. In the early 1980s, Harold taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, lecture in auditoriums packed with students who admired both his brilliance and his humility. He had that rare gift, the ability to turn even the most intimidating equations into something human, almost poetic. When he spoke about chaos theory, he would tell stories of storms, love, and how even disorder followed hidden laws. His students said he could make numbers breathe. His office was always messy. Chalk dust on the floor, papers filled with looping equations, and half-empty coffee cups that smelled of midnight calculations. Yet inside that chaos was a strange harmony. The blackboard behind his desk was covered in the rough sketches of what would become one of his greatest pursuits, a mathematical model to optimize train traffic across major U.S. cities. Back then, public transit systems were drowning in inefficiency. Delays piled up like unwanted baggage, and millions of dollars vanished every year. Harold believed he could fix it. His model, elegant, recursive, and astonishingly adaptive, could predict train movement down to the second, adjusting dynamically to weather, delays, and passenger load. It wasn't just math. It was art in motion. He presented it at conferences, shared it with transportation boards, and even caught the attention of a senator who called it the future of urban transit. For a brief, blinding moment, Harold Finn was not just another professor scribbling on chalkboards. He was the mathematician who might save America's railways. But the future has a cruel sense of timing. Just as his algorithm began attracting serious attention, the economy stumbled. Budgets were slashed, research programs gutted. Transportation reform was pushed aside for defense contracts and political noise. One morning, Harold walked into his office to find a letter on his desk. Program terminated. Funding withdrawn. Years of work vanished in a single paragraph. At first, he told himself it was temporary, that someone would recognize the value of what he had done, that another university would take him in. But weeks turned into months, and the calls never came. Younger professors with sharper elbows and flashier presentations filled the slots. He was 55, recently divorced, and slowly realizing that the world no longer had room for patient minds. The department head, a man half his age, invited him to lunch one afternoon to talk about options. Harold listened quietly as the younger man smiled sympathetically and suggested early retirement. You've had a distinguished career, Harold. Maybe it's time to rest, enjoy life, travel. Travel. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent 2 decades studying how to move people efficiently across the country, yet now he could barely move himself out of his own house. He spent the next few weeks wandering Boston with no particular destination. Sometimes he sat in cafes, sketching patterns on napkins. Other times, he stood near subway entrances, watching the trains roar beneath his feet. He missed the hum of logic, the thrill of seeing a system come alive through numbers. And though he would never admit aloud, he missed the respect, that quiet, glowing admiration in the eyes of students when they finally understood a concept he'd been explaining for weeks. But most of all, he missed purpose. The first snowfall of winter came early that year. Harold found himself walking through Union Central Station, the massive, echoing terminal he had once used as a case study for his transportation models. It was a cathedral of movement, marble floors polished by decades of footsteps, grand steel arches that caught the light, and a sound that was half thunder, half heartbeat. The smell of coffee mixed with cold air and engine grease. He stood there for nearly an hour, just watching the flow of commuters, the hurried businessmen checking watches, the mothers pulling children along, the lovers parting with lingering hands. The trains came and went with mechanical precision, yet he saw something deeper, the invisible choreography of data and timing beneath it all. It was beautiful. And then he noticed a sign, help wanted, ticket clerk, booth number 7. He almost laughed. The universe, it seemed, had a strange sense of humor. That evening, Harold sat at his kitchen table, staring at the newspaper listing. It wasn't the kind of job anyone with a PhD in mathematics would normally consider, but he had no illusions left. His savings were running low. Teaching offers had dried up. Consulting firms wanted fresh perspectives, a polite way of saying younger faces. He took a deep breath, folded the paper neatly, and said to the empty room, "Why not?" The next morning, he walked back into Union Central Station, not as a scholar or a guest, but as an applicant. The hiring officer, a woman in her 30s, barely glanced at his resume. "You've got experience with data entry and calculations?" Harold smiled faintly. "You could say that." She nodded. "The pay isn't much, but it's steady. We need someone reliable, good with numbers. Most of the system is automated now, so it's mostly verification work." He signed the forms without hesitation. When she handed him a small silver badge reading clerk number 7, he felt an odd sense of symmetry, a full circle closing silently in the space of a heartbeat. That afternoon, Harold Finn, once a professor of applied mathematics, began training as a ticket seller. The booth was small, barely large enough for one person. A glass window separated him from the endless stream of travelers. On the desk lay a digital terminal, a receipt printer, and a pen chained to the counter. Not for signatures, but as a relic of habit. The job was monotonous at first. Print the ticket, hand it over, repeat. Most passengers didn't even look at him. They looked past him toward their phones, the screens, the future. But Harold found patterns in the monotony. The rush hours, the intervals between trains, the rhythm of footsteps that told him which lines were about to crowd up. Even the way passengers queued followed invisible distributions. Poisson-like, he thought with quiet amusement. Sometimes, when the system lagged, he did the math himself, calculating total fares by hand faster than the screen could refresh. The younger clerk stared, half impressed, half confused. "Mr. Finn, you just did that in your head?" "Won the math once." "Old habits," he said, smiling. "And good coffee." He became a curiosity in the department. The old man with the silver pen and impossible accuracy. Some joked that he belonged in a museum. Others said he was lucky not to have been replaced by a machine. Harold never argued. He didn't need to. His quiet competence spoke for itself. At night, when the terminal lights dimmed and the last train whistle echoed through the hall, Harold stayed behind. He liked to check the ledgers manually, to make sure every figure matched, every total balanced. It gave him a sense of calm, the same peace he once found in solving proofs. He would sit in the silence, surrounded by the soft hum of the cooling systems, and whisper to himself, "A pattern is never wasted, even when no one sees it." Years passed. The world outside changed faster than ever. Touchless payments, self-service kiosks, digital IDs. But Harold stayed the same. His movements were steady, deliberate. He was part of the station, like the marble columns or the clock that still chimed every hour, even though no one listened anymore. Commuters came to recognize him, the polite man with the calm voice and impeccable handwriting. Some even lined up at his booth on purpose, saying his tickets felt luckier. He would chuckle quietly and hand them their slips, always folding them perfectly along the printed line. He didn't know it then, but his quiet life at booth number 7 was preparing him for the day that would change everything. The day when the machines would fail and the forgotten mathematician would rise again. As he locked the booth that night and stepped into the empty corridor, the station lights reflected off his silver badge, glinting like a small star in the dark. He didn't see himself as special anymore. He was simply a man who kept things running, a tiny cog in a great, beautiful mechanism. But somewhere deep inside, in the quiet recesses of his mind, the old equation still glowed, the elegance of order, the thrill of symmetry, the heartbeat of numbers. And that spark, though buried beneath decades of routine, would soon be called upon once more. The next morning would begin like any other: coffee, uniform, booth, passengers. But before the day was done, the entire station would stop. The system would die. Panic would spread. And Harold Finn, the man everyone had overlooked, would pick up his pen and remind the world that brilliance, The station always woke before the city did. Before dawn's first light reached the windows, Union Central was already alive, a breathing, pulsing organism of metal, footsteps, and motion. The great glass dome above the concourse caught the pale reflection of the early trains departing into fog, and the floor trembled softly with each passing engine. Somewhere in that vast hum of humanity, Harold Finn walked across the marble tiles, his footsteps steady, echoing faintly between the distant announcements. He liked arriving early. The air at that hour was cool and untouched. No shouting passengers, no impatient lines. Just the sound of the single janitor's mop dragging across the polished floor, the hiss of the first espresso machine from the corner cafe, and the rhythmic clicking of lights switching on one row at a time. He carried a small brown paper bag with his breakfast, a plain roll, and a thermos of coffee. Every morning, he sat on the same bench near track 11, unwrapping the bread carefully, watching the first commuters drift in. He never rushed. That quiet 30 minutes before the crowd arrived was his meditation, his way of aligning himself before the noise of the day began. Sometimes he still thought like a mathematician. He would count the number of people passing by and estimate the average interval between footsteps. He'd calculate how many seconds it would take the sunbeam creeping across the floor to reach the western wall. And every now and then, when a train glided in perfectly on schedule, he felt a small flicker of pride, as though one of his old equations were still somewhere in the system, silently working. At exactly 6:40 a.m., he stood, folded the bag, and walked toward his booth. Booth number 7 sat halfway down the row, between a flower stand and a vending machine that constantly jammed. The small brass plate above the glass window read Harold Finn, clerk in neatly engraved letters. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and took a deep breath. The booth smelled faintly of paper, ink, and disinfectant. He hung his coat neatly on the hook, placed the thermos beside the computer monitor, and pressed the small button that powered up the terminal. The screen flickered, lines of green code flashing briefly before the familiar digital interface appeared. Union Central Ticketing, version 4. "Good morning, Harold," said a cheerful voice from the next booth. It was Jared, one of the younger clerks, still in his 20s, always energetic, always slightly too loud for mornings. "Morning, Jared," Harold replied, adjusting his glasses. "You hear the rumor? They're talking about upgrading the system again next month. AI-based scheduling. No more manual override." Harold smiled faintly. "Progress never waits, does it?" Jared laughed. "Not unless you trip over it." The first passengers began to arrive shortly after 7. A slow trickle at first, then a steady stream. Men in suits, women in wool coats, tourists dragging suitcases. The glass between Harold and the crowd framed a living mosaic of motion. "Next, please," he said gently. A woman approached, clutching her phone. "One to Albany, please. First class." He entered the route, selected the seat, printed the ticket, and slid it under the glass. She barely looked at him, eyes fixed on her screen. He didn't mind. He had long since stopped expecting acknowledgement. For him, the beauty lay in the process, the symmetry of order, the balance of inputs and outputs. Each transaction was like a small equation, and he liked solving it cleanly. By 8, the concourse had become a current of bodies, the hum of voices, the clicking of shoes, the distant echoes of announcements blending together like white noise. Harold worked through it with quiet precision, his fingers gliding across the keyboard, his pen occasionally jotting down notes when the printer lagged. He had seen every kind of passenger over the years, the hurried executives, the lost tourists, the nervous first-time travelers clutching maps like lifelines. Each one carried a small piece of humanity's chaos, and Harold's job was to turn that chaos into something organized, a ticket, a destination, a number that fit neatly into a pattern. At 10:30, during the mid-morning lull, Jared leaned over from the next booth. "Hey, Mr. Finn, how you stay so calm all the time? I swear, one more customer yelling about prices, and I'm going to lose it." Harold looked up, smiling. "It's just math, Jared. Everything is. Even anger has a rhythm. You just have to wait for it to peak and fall." "Math, huh? You really think numbers can explain people?" Harold paused for a moment, eyes drifting to crowd outside. "Not explain," he said softly. but they can reveal patterns. And once you see the pattern, nothing surprises you anymore. Jared laughed. You're a strange one, Mr. Finn. I've been called worse. The rest of the day passed in its usual cadence. The morning rush gave way to the slow trickle of late travelers, then a brief quiet before the lunch wave. Harold moved through it all like a conductor keeping time, the sound of tickets tearing in printers, humming, forming a kind of mechanical symphony. Around 1:30, the supervisor stopped by, Mrs. Carver, a sharp, efficient woman who managed clerks with both firmness and fairness. She liked Harold. He never complained, never called in sick, never made mistakes. Everything all right here, Harold? Smooth as usual, he said without looking up. Good. IT mentioned some lag issues in the system. Just keep an eye out in case it freezes. You're the only one I trust not to panic. He gave a small nod. Understood. When she left, he allowed himself a brief smile. Trust was a currency rarer than money in this place. By late afternoon, the golden light from the dome spilled across the counters, casting long shadows over the floor. The station took on a dreamlike quality, half real, half reflection. Harold's booth gleamed faintly in the glow. He sipped his coffee, now cold, and continued processing tickets. The numbers rolled across his screen like waves. Departures, arrivals, connections. He knew most of them by heart. He had memorized nearly every train schedule on the Eastern Corridor without ever trying to. It simply stayed in his mind, like music from a familiar song. Outside, a little girl pressed her face against a glass while her mother waited in line. Harold smiled and waved his pen like a magic wand. The girl giggled. When she reached the counter, her mother said, "She likes you. Says you look like her grandpa." "Tell her grandpa has excellent taste," Harold said warmly, handing over their tickets. The woman laughed. "You got away with people. Only when they're shorter than 4 feet tall." As they left, he felt a small warmth in his chest, a reminder that kindness still existed in the rhythm of daily work. The hours slipped by. Evening descended. The crowd thinned. The digital screens above the concourse flickered as the night trains were announced. It was a pattern Harold knew by heart, the final calm before the next day's storm. But that night, something subtle changed. At precisely 7:03 p.m., as he was closing out a sale to a businessman heading to Philadelphia, the computer paused. Just a flicker, a half-second delay. Then the screen refreshed. Harold frowned slightly. He tapped the key again. The terminal caught up. No error message. Still, a quiet unease crept into his thoughts. Systems rarely lagged at this hour. He made a note on his pad. Minor delay, 7:03 p.m. He stayed late that evening, as he often did, reviewing the logs manually. Everything balanced, every transaction accounted for, every ticket reconciled. The pen in his hand moved steadily across the page. His handwriting as precise as the rows of numbers he once wrote in equations long ago. When he finally stood to leave, the station was nearly empty. The janitor swept the floors in slow circles. The security guards chatted quietly near the entrance, and the great clock above the concourse ticked toward 9. Harold slipped on his coat, folded the day's report, and placed it neatly in the outbox. Then, before locking up, he looked once more at the terminal. The green light on the monitor flickered faintly, like an uncertain heartbeat. He thought about calling IT. Then he shook his head. Probably nothing. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the city greeted him with the familiar sounds of traffic and distant horns. He adjusted his scarf, breathing in the crisp October wind. It was a good night, clear skies, steady air, no rain. The kind of night that felt ordinary, almost reassuring. But as he crossed the street toward the bus stop, he glanced back once more at the grand facade of Union Central Station. The lights inside shimmered behind the glass, reflections moving like data streams. He felt a sudden pang, a quiet intuition that something fragile was about to break. He couldn't explain it, but years of mathematical instinct told him when systems were about to fail. The smallest fluctuations, the barely noticeable delays, the way a single variable slipped out of alignment, these were things he could feel even before they happened. And that night, he felt it. Something in the machine was off. He didn't sleep well. The hum of the city outside his apartment seemed louder than usual, like distant static. Around midnight, he got up, poured himself a glass of water, and opened his old notebook, the one filled with his transit models from years ago. The pages were yellowed, edges curled, but the formulas still made perfect sense. He ran his finger along the equations, murmuring quietly, "Balance, always balance." He fell asleep at the desk sometime after 2, the notebook still open beneath his hand. When morning came, he woke to the sound of his alarm, dressed, and made his way back to the station as always. The sky was gray, the air heavier than usual. The cafe clerk greeted him with a nod. The janitor waved. Everything looked the same, but the feeling of unease had not left him. He walked into the concourse, the familiar rhythm of travelers unfolding before him. But as he neared his booth, he noticed a strange stillness in the air, the kind that comes right before a storm. The station lights seemed a fraction dimmer. The hum of the computers felt slower, as though the system itself was holding its breath. Harold sat down, placed his thermos beside the monitor, and powered up the terminal. The loading bar took longer than usual to fill. When the interface finally appeared, it blinked twice before settling. He stared at it for a long moment, then exhaled quietly. "Let's hope you're still awake today," he muttered to the screen. The first passenger approached, unaware that anything was wrong. Harold smiled politely, took the payment, and began entering the data. The numbers appeared sluggish, the cursor moving a beat slower than his keystrokes. He waited, patient, unbothered. He had seen systems freeze before. But this time, there was something different. A deeper hesitation in the code, as if the entire network were sinking under invisible weight. He finished the transaction manually, scribbling a quick backup note on his pad, an old habit he never gave up. The passenger left satisfied, but Harold's eyes lingered on the screen long after. Outside, the station clock struck 8. A new wave of commuters filled the hall. The day had begun in earnest, loud and chaotic as always. But beneath that familiar chaos, something unseen had already started to unravel, a silent countdown ticking toward failure. And when it came, all the systems would go dark. The lines would stretch, voices would rise, and only one man, an old mathematician with a pen in steady hands, would know how to bring order back from the brink. Harold didn't know it yet, but this was the last normal morning Union Central Station would ever see. The morning rush came like a tide, loud, fast, and unstoppable. By 8:30, Union Central Station was a living sea of motion. Voices echoed beneath the steel arches, rolling in waves across the concourse. The sound of rolling suitcases and squealing brakes filled the air, mixing with the sharp scent of coffee and engine oil. The station's great clock, looming high above, kept its steady rhythm. Tick, 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 counting down a moment when everything would stop. Harold Finn sat quietly behind the glass of booth number 7, as he always did, his pen and thermos beside him. The soft hum of his computer was background noise, a familiar companion. He watched the lines grow longer, the faces blur together. It was all part of the pattern he knew so well. The morning was predictable. It always had been. And then at 9:17 a.m., something shifted. It started as a faint flicker on his screen. The green digital text blinked twice and froze. Harold frowned, tapping the key lightly. No response. He tried again. Nothing. A moment later, the lights above the booths dimmed for half a second, then flared back to life. Around him, other clerks looked up in confusion. "Is your system lagging?" Jared called from the next booth. "Seems so," Harold replied, eyes still fixed on the screen. The loading wheel spun endlessly, a silent spiral. Then came the pop-up, "Connection lost to central database." "Probably a short outage," Jared said, half to himself, half to everyone. "IT will fix it." But IT didn't fix it. Not that minute, not the next. At 9:23 a.m., the main departure screens flickered and went black. Gasps rose from the crowd as the scrolling timetables vanished. The rhythmic hum of printers stopped. For a brief, eerie instant, Union Central, the heart of a city's movement, fell silent. And then the storm began. "Excuse me, what's going on?" My train to Baltimore, is it canceled? Why aren't the screens working? The noise surged, questions stacking like falling dominoes. The clerks looked helplessly at one another, their frozen terminals blinking red error codes. Jared cursed under his breath. Mrs. Carver, the supervisor, hurried in from the back office. Radio pressed her ear. "Everyone stay calm," she called out, her voice tight but controlled. "It's a network failure. We're contacting headquarters." Passengers crowded the counters, frustration rising like heat. Someone slammed a palm against Harold's glass. "I paid for an express ticket. What do you mean you can't print it?" Harold met the man's angry eyes calmly. "The system is down, sir. Please give a moment." "A moment? I have a meeting in Philadelphia in 2 hours." Behind the man, more voices joined in. The line was swelling. Panic was contagious. Harold took a breath. His mind, sharpened by years of equations and order, began to analyze the chaos away he would a complex data set. The human noise, the scattered movement, it all had rhythm, even if no one else could hear it. He saw the symmetry in the disorder, the way panic spread geometrically outward from a single point. And within that noise, he recognized something deeper, an opportunity to restore balance. While the others fumbled with their frozen terminals, Harold opened the drawer beneath his desk. Inside was a stack of old carbon copy ticket forms, relics from forgotten age, kept only because he'd insisted years ago they should remain just in case. He laid the pad flat, uncapped his pen, and said quietly, "Next, please." The woman at the front of his line blinked, confused. "But the computer?" "I don't need it," Harold said. "Where are you going?" "Albany. Train 14. He nodded, writing swiftly. His pen moved in clean strokes. Name, route, fare, departure time. Each digit fell into place with mathematical precision. "You paid online?" "Yes." He tore the ticket, handed it over. "This will get you there. Seat 32B. "How?" "It's all right," he said softly. "Next." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she clutched the ticket and hurried away. The next passenger stepped up. Soon, word spread that one booth was still open. The line at number 7 lengthened as the others shut down completely. Jared leaned over, bewildered. "Mr. Finn, what are you doing?" "Selling tickets." "You can't. The database is offline." "I don't need the database." Jared laughed nervously. "You're joking, right?" Harold didn't answer. His pen kept moving, steady, confident, unstoppable. Each transaction he completed was recorded by hand, the totals balanced mentally. He adjusted fares by memory, cross-checked schedules he'd long since memorized, assigned seats with perfect accuracy. The pattern unfolded naturally in his head, like music. At first, the other clerks watched in disbelief. Then they started whispering. Then, slowly, a few began to follow his lead. But none could keep up. Within an hour, Harold had processed over 60 passengers, flawlessly. Mrs. Carver returned, her radio still hissing static. "Harold, what on earth?" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the pile of handwritten tickets. "Are those all correct?" "They should be," he said without looking up. "Train 22's capacity is 108. I've sold 82 seats so far, all window and aisle balance maintained. That leaves 26. Would you like me to mark them?" She just stared. "You're doing this from memory?" He smiled faintly. "Habit." By 10:30, chaos reigned outside the booths. IT technicians ran cables across the floor. Reporters from a local network arrived with cameras, and the station's loudspeakers repeated the same apology every 5 minutes. "We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain patient." But at booth number 7, things were different. Order, fragile but real, was returning. The passengers at Harold's counter waited quietly now, watching the old man in the gray vest work with the focus of a surgeon. His pen scratched softly against the paper, the ink flowing like thought itself. Among the waiting travelers was Clara Wells, a data analyst from Boston heading to New York for a presentation. She stood 2 rows back, observing the scene with growing fascination. She'd spent years designing predictive systems, algorithms meant to optimize logistics and efficiency. And yet here in front of her stood a man doing the same thing without a single line of code. When her turn came, she approached slowly. "You're still writing tickets by hand?" Harold looked up briefly. "That's right. How do you know which seats are free?" "I keep count." "In your head?" He nodded. "Yes." She frowned, intrigued. "You're using some kind of pattern, aren't you?" "Not random assignment." "Nothing is random," he said simply. She studied the sheet as he wrote. Columns of letters and numbers arranged with startling precision. There was structure there, she realized. Logic. A hidden system of checks and balances. "You're calculating permutations," she murmured, half to herself. He smiled. "Something like that." When he handed her the ticket, she saw that each digit on it aligned perfectly within the column, as though printed by machine. She wanted to ask more, but the crowd behind her pushed forward. She stepped aside, still watching. The hours passed, but Harold showed no sign of slowing. His hand never trembled. His writing never faltered. The other clerks began referring stranded passengers to him. By noon, booth number 7 was the only functioning point of sale in the entire terminal. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. Someone from a management office approached Mrs. Carver, asking, "Who is that man?" She answered quietly, "Harold Finn. He's been here 22 years. When the lunch hour came, Clara returned to the booth with 2 coffees. She waited until his line cleared briefly, then slid one through the slot. "You've been at it for hours," she said. "You should take a break." He looked at the cup, surprised. "Thank you, but I'm fine." "I analyzed your writing pattern," she said with a small smile. "You're using a Latin square system, aren't you? Ensuring no seat or time repeats in the same set." Harold's eyes twinkled. "You noticed. I'm a data analyst. It's my job to notice." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then you also know why it works. Balance through constraint. Harmony through limitation. Most people wouldn't call limitations harmonious. Most people never learn the music in silence," he said, turning back to his work. She watched him a moment longer, captivated by the serenity in his motion. Around them, the station was still half broken, screens dead, voices impatient. Yet in that tiny booth, there was perfect order. By 2:30, IT had finally located the problem. A corrupted central server in Chicago had taken down the network across 6 states. It would take hours to restore. But thanks to Harold, trains had continued to depart on time. Conductors checked his handwritten manifests and found no conflicts, no duplicates, no missing passengers. Word spread fast. The story of the ticket seller who saved the station rippled through the crowd. Some passengers took photos. Others simply smiled in quiet awe. For the first time all day, there was applause, soft at first, then growing until it filled the concourse like a warm wave. Harold looked up, startled. He gave a modest nod, embarrassed. "Just doing my job," he said, but his voice was lost beneath the sound. Mrs. Carver leaned over. "You might have saved us a lawsuit today, Harold." He chuckled softly. "Well, that's one equation solved." As the afternoon light faded into amber, the crisis slowly eased. The network flickered back to life at 5:41 p.m., and terminals began rebooting. The other clerks cheered, but Harold didn't join them. He kept writing until the last passenger in line had their ticket. Then he finally set the pen down, exhaled, and rolled his stiff shoulders. When he looked around, the station felt different. Quieter, almost reverent. People were still talking about him, pointing, whispering. He ignored it. The applause, the praise, there were noise. What mattered was the pattern restored, the balance regained. Clara returned once more, standing by the booth with a look that was half wonder, half respect. "You know," she said softly, "what you did today was extraordinary." He shook his head. "No, ordinary work done carefully. That's all." She smiled. "Then maybe we need more ordinary people like you." He met her eyes, and for the first time that day he laughed, a quiet, genuine sound. "Careful what you wish for. The world might get boring." "Somehow," she said, I doubt it." He closed his ledger, wiped the ink from his fingers, and looked once more at the flickering screens as they returned to life. Numbers filled them again, cold precise, automated. But after a day spent relying on nothing but memory and logic, those numbers seemed somehow less alive than before. That night, after the last train departed, Harold stayed behind to organize the handwritten records. The janitor passing by paused at the sight of the stacks of tickets, each one perfectly aligned. "Didn't think anyone still used paper," the janitor said. Harold smiled. Sometimes the old methods remember what the new ones forget. He placed the final ticket on the pile and switched off the light. The station, now empty, echoed softly, a mechanical heart beating slower, steadier. When he stepped outside into the cool night, Clara was waiting near the exit, a folder in hand. "I printed this for you," she said. Inside were copies of his handwritten forms from earlier that day, scanned and neatly arranged. "I thought you might want to keep them. It's history, after all." He looked at the folder, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Miss Wells." "Clara," she said. "And, Harold, you should know, the local news is running your story tonight." He sighed, amused. "That's unnecessary." "Maybe, but people should see it. Not every problem needs a new machine. Sometimes it needs an old mind." He chuckled. Old minds are rarely fashionable. Maybe it's time they were. They stood in silence for a moment, the city lights reflecting off the glass doors behind them. Then Harold said quietly, "You see, Clara, mathematics isn't just numbers. It's how you hold still when the world moves too fast." She nodded. "And today, you prove that better than any algorithm." He looked toward the distant tracks, where the final train's headlights disappeared into the darkness. "Maybe, but the real challenge," he said, "isn't solving the problem. It's teaching others to see the pattern before it breaks." As he turned to leave, Clara called out, "Will you be back tomorrow?" "Of course," he said, smiling. "Someone has to keep the rhythm." He walked away slowly, his figure shrinking against the glow of the city, while behind the giant clock struck 9, the same rhythm it always had. Only now it sounded different, fuller, as if the gears themselves had learned something from a man who refused to stop thinking. And though the station would run on computers again the next morning, somewhere deep in its circuits, a trace of his order remained. A silent echo of the day, a single human mind kept the trains moving when everything else stood still. Morning came softly, as if the city itself was hesitant to wake after what had happened. A pale winter sun crept through the glass roof of Union Central, spilling long streaks of gold across the marble floor. The usual hum of motion returned, footsteps, coffee cups clinking, the distant hiss of engines. Yet beneath it all lingered a current of quiet awe. Something had changed in the air. The commuters couldn't name it, but they could feel it. When Harold Finn arrived at the station that morning, his steps were as measured as ever. He wore the same pressed gray vest, the same neatly folded scarf. He nodded to the janitor, who paused mid-sweep and gave a little salute. Even the security guard at the entrance smiled in recognition. "Morning, Mr. Finn," the guard said. "Heard you saved us all yesterday." Harold chuckled softly. "I just kept the trains running." But as he passed through the concourse, he realized people were watching him. Not rudely, not mockingly, but with something like respect. Some passengers whispered. Others smiled as they crossed his path. On the far wall, the local newspaper was tacked to the bulletin board, and there, just below the fold, was a photograph. An old man behind a ticket window, pen in hand, mid-motion. The headline read, "The Man Who Outsmarted the System." He stopped, studied the picture for a moment, and felt both amused and embarrassed. The photograph caught him in the act of concentration, eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight, the pen suspended between motion and thought. He hadn't known anyone was taking pictures. He sighed quietly and continued walking. Inside booth number 7, everything was just as he'd left it, orderly, exact, familiar. The computer was back online now, humming steadily, blinking its sterile green light. He turned it on out of routine, not out of trust. For a while, he simply sat there, listening to the station's rhythm. It felt good to be back, even if the attention made him slightly uneasy. At 9 o'clock, Clara appeared at his window, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You made the front page," she said. smiling. "So I saw," Harold replied. "It's rather excessive, don't you think? You call saving an entire station excessive?" He shrugged. "I call it Tuesday." Clara laughed, then set the coffee on the counter. "They're calling you the human algorithm." "That's terribly unromantic," he said. "True," she agreed, "but surprisingly accurate." He raised an eyebrow. "Accurate? You weren't just guessing yesterday," she said. "I ran the numbers last night. Every seat you assigned was mathematically balanced. No overlaps, no errors, not even random distribution. You followed Aladdin square logic, but with adaptive variation. That's not something you stumble into. That's training." He didn't answer right away. The corners of his mouth lifted faintly, then fell again. Training, perhaps, or maybe old habits die harder than people expect. Clara tilted her head. "You used to teach, didn't you?" The question landed softly, yet it stirred something deep within him. He looked down at the ticket pad on his counter, then up at her. For a moment, the noise of the station faded. "I used to teach many things," he said finally. "Mathematics, systems, the illusion that everything could be predicted if you just work hard enough." "MIT," she guessed. He smiled, impressed. "You're very observant." "Curious," she corrected. "It's part of my job." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Yes, a lifetime ago." Clara's eyes widened. "You're Harold Finn." "The Harold Finn?" "I'm afraid there's only the one," he said, amused. "I read your papers in graduate school," she exclaimed. "The transport optimization models, the stochastic balance theory. You were a legend." "Legends are just people whose names survive their usefulness," Harold replied gently. She shook her head, half laughing, half in disbelief. "You built the model that predicted real-time scheduling efficiency. I used parts of it in my own project 2 years ago. Did it work?" "Almost too well. I suppose that's something." They both fell silent for a moment. Outside the booth, the crowd ebbed and flowed, unaware that a quiet reunion of eras was taking place behind the glass. The past and present meeting between 2 cups of coffee. Clara leaned closer. "Why are you here, Harold? Why a ticket booth?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because the numbers stopped matching when the people disappeared from them. Somewhere along the way, the equations became cleaner, but the world became colder. I suppose I wanted to see if logic could still serve humanity directly, not just in theory, but in touch." She considered his words carefully. "You found a pattern in chaos." "I found peace in it," he said quietly. For a while, neither spoke. The rhythmic announcements filled the silence. "Train 14 now boarding. Track 3. Harold's hand moved automatically, printing tickets, processing payments, his mind half here, half drifting through memories of chalk dust in classrooms. By midday, a few journalists arrived at the station, holding cameras and notepads. They wanted quotes, stories, interviews. Mrs. Carver came over, apologetic. "They're from Channel 9. They want to film you at work." "Harold," he sighed, "is that really necessary? They say it's inspirational." "I'd rather inspire punctual trains and headlines." She laughed. "You're too modest." But the cameras came anyway. They set up across the concourse, filming him through the glass as he worked. The calm, deliberate motions of his hand, the gentle cadence of his voice. He ignored them as best he could, focusing instead on precision of each ticket, the quiet satisfaction of order restored. At one point, a reporter asked him through the intercom, "Mr. Finn, what's your secret? How did you manage to keep track of so many passengers without a system?" He smiled. "Who says I didn't have one?" The station erupted in laughter, but he meant every word. His system wasn't digital. It was mental, built on years of pattern recognition, intuition, and an unbroken love for the elegance of logic. Later that afternoon, as the last camera packed away, Clara returned with a small notebook. "I hope you don't mind," she said, sliding it under the glass. "I've been writing about yesterday. Not for the press. For myself. I'm trying to understand what I saw." He flipped through a few pages. They were filled with sketches of grids, handwritten formulas, annotations in fine blue ink. "You've mapped my process," he said. "Part of it. But there's something more I can't quite capture." The human part. He nodded thoughtfully. That's the part you can't model. It's not predictable. Even for you? Especially for me, he said, smiling. As the sun lowered beyond the glass dome, the light grew warm and golden. The station quieted, the crowd thinning to scattered silhouettes. Harold's reflection appeared faintly in the window, an old man surrounded by motion, yet apart from it. Clara watched him for a long moment. You know, she said softly, I think people are drawn to you because you remind them the human brain still matters. Everything now is automated, instant reactive, forgettable. But you showed them that precision can also have soul. Precision without soul is merely calculation, he murmured. But soul without precision is chaos. The balance, that's where beauty lives. Like your equations, she said. Like life, he replied. Outside, the sky deepened into violet. Lights flickered on one by one. A train horn wailed somewhere in the distance, long and mournful. Mrs. Carver stopped by one last time before closing. Harold, Corporal wants to honor you next week. A small ceremony. Nothing too fancy. He frowned. A ceremony? Don't worry. No speeches if you don't want them. They just want to thank you. He smiled wearily. Tell them the best thanks they can give is a system that doesn't crash again. She laughed. You really don't like attention, do you? I've had my fill of it, he said softly. When she left, Clara lingered. You really mean that? I spent half my life chasing recognition, he admitted. It took the other half to realize how little it meant. He began tidying the counter, stacking papers, aligning pens, small rituals of order. Clara watched him, sensing something unspoken beneath his calm exterior, something that wasn't simply modesty but an old, quiet grief. Did something happen? She asked gently. He paused, his hand resting on the ticket ledger. Once, he said, a long time ago, I was offered a chance to patent my transport algorithm. It could have revolutionized the rail industry, but the university sold it to a private firm instead. They stripped out the human element, the variables that accounted for unpredictability. Within a year, their system caused a scheduling collapse that cost lives. After that, I couldn't look at my equations the same way. They'd been used to make efficiency more important than empathy. Clara's eyes softened. So you came here. I came here to remember why numbers exist, he said. To serve people, not replace them. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of his words settling like dust in the fading light. Finally, he smiled faintly. Strange, isn't it? A lifetime of mathematics. And the only thing I ever truly learned was that perfection without compassion is failure. That sounds like something worth teaching, she said. Perhaps, he replied. But teaching requires students. And I think the world stopped listening to teachers some time ago. She met his gaze, steady and sincere. Then, maybe it's time the world started again. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw in her eyes the same curiosity, the same hunger for understanding that he once saw in his students decades ago. It was both comforting and bittersweet. You remind me of someone, he said quietly. Who? A young woman in my first-year seminar. She built a perfect equation once, flawless, efficient, cold. When I asked her what it meant, she said, it means I can predict everything. I told her that if you can predict everything, you've already lost the wonder of it. Did she ever understand? Clara asked. He smiled sadly. I hope so. The station clock struck 8. The sound rolled through the hall like the closing of a chapter. Clara gathered her bag. You should write about this, Harold. Not the system, not the math. People should know why you did what you did. He chuckled softly. I doubt anyone would read it. I would, she said. He looked down at the coffee cup she'd left, now empty, and nodded. Then maybe one day. As she walked away, the reflection of her figure faded against the glass, leaving him alone once more with the rhythmic hum of the machines. He sat for a while, staring at the faint glow of his monitor, thinking about the irony of it all. How a man who once built algorithms for efficiency had found meaning only when he stopped trusting them. He switched off the light, gathered his coat, and stepped into the quiet concourse. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, filled with the distant murmur of traffic. He walked slowly, his thoughts drifting between the past and the present. The city lights blurred into soft constellations against the glass towers, like numbers rearranging themselves into meaning. Somewhere behind him, in the great heart of the station, the automated systems hummed back to perfect order. Every schedule realigned, every train on time. But Harold knew better than anyone that perfection was an illusion, a fragile equilibrium maintained only by the unseen hands that cared enough to keep it balanced. He reached the street corner, paused under the flickering lamppost, and looked back. Through the windows of Union Central, he could see booth number 7 glowing faintly under the overhead lights, a small box of order in a world that would always tilt toward chaos. He smiled, tucked his hands into his coat pockets, and whispered to the night. Balance achieved. Then he turned and walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the glow of the city. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, his name would spread beyond the station. Reporters would call. Former students would reach out. Universities would remember a professor who had vanished from academia. And once again, the world would come knocking at his quiet little booth, not for tickets, but for answers. And when it did, Harold Finn would have to decide whether to stay in the anonymity he'd built or step once more into the light of the world that had once broken him. By dawn, his name had already traveled farther than any train leaving Union Central that morning. Mathematician turned ticket seller saved station. Read the digital headlines splashed across morning news sites. On social media, videos of the calm old man writing tickets by hand were everywhere. Clips recorded by passengers during the blackout. In one, his hand moved with mechanical precision, while the crowd behind him murmured in disbelief. In another, the camera zoomed in on his face as he smiled faintly at a young woman, handing her a handwritten slip that looked almost too perfect to be real. The comments beneath each post blurred together. Who is he? Is it staged? Genius doesn't fade, it hides. By the time Harold reached the station that morning, reporters were already waiting. Cameras, microphones, flashing bulbs, all focused on booth number 7. He stopped at the entrance, startled by the crowd. Someone shouted his name. Another waved a microphone in his direction. Mr. Finn, just one question. How did you do it? He smiled politely, sidestepping them. By writing, he said simply. You might try it sometime. The commuters laughed. The reporters didn't. They followed him through the hall until Mrs. Carver appeared like a protective wall. Give the man some space, she barked, ushering him through the small employee door behind the booth. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, the calm after a storm. He hung his coat, adjusted his glasses, and sat down. The computer screen glowed faintly, its green light steady once more. He looked at it the way a man might look at an old adversary who had finally surrendered. When the intercom buzzed, Mrs. Carver's voice came through. Harold, you all right out there? Perfectly fine, he said. They're calling from Boston. Some university wants to confirm your credentials. He sighed. I suppose hiding is out of question. Not unless you plan to change your name. He smiled. Too late for that. The morning rush began as usual. Tickets printed, questions answered, complaints softened with calm precision. But the rhythm felt different. People lingered longer at his counter, wanted to see him up close. Some asked for autographs on their tickets. Others just said thank you, as though he'd done something miraculous. Around 11, Clara appeared again, carrying a stack of papers. You've gone viral, she said. I suspected as much, he replied. Harvard called. They want to interview you for an alumni feature. The MIT press office reached out too. He shook his head. I left that world behind. Maybe that world hasn't left you. He smiled faintly. That's what worries me. She leaned against the counter, studying him. You don't like the attention, do you? I like accuracy, he said. Attention distorts things, but it also inspires. Inspiration is overrated, he murmured. Consistency matters more. Clara laughed softly. You know, you're the only person I've ever met who can make humility sound like defiance. He gave her a look somewhere between amusement and warning. Defiance is the young. Maybe, she said, but the young are listening. Later that afternoon, Channel 9 aired the full segment. It showed archival footage from decades earlier, a grainy interview from the 1980s where a younger Harold Finn stood before a chalkboard filled with swirling equations. The reporter's voice narrated, "Once a rising star in applied mathematics, Dr. Harold Finn left academia abruptly in the late 1990s. Now, decades later, his unexpected heroism has reignited interest in his work. He watched it that evening on a small television in his apartment, alone, the volume low. Seeing his younger self was like meeting a stranger, confident, articulate, unscarred by disappointment. He watched the man on the screen talk passionately about predictive algorithms, transportation grids, optimization, innovation. The man smiled easily. His eyes burned with purpose. Then the broadcast cut to footage of the station. The gray-haired clerk, sleeves rolled up, writing tickets by hand under flickering lights. The reporter called it a poetic full circle. Harold switched the TV off. The silence in the apartment deepened. He sat back, listening to the distant city traffic. It sounded like static, like a machine whispering old memories. The next morning brought letters, real ones, not emails. Envelopes postmarked from universities, rail companies, and old colleagues who had seen the broadcast. Some congratulated him. Others asked for consultations. A few even proposed reinstating him as an honorary professor. He read them all slowly, one by one, then placed them neatly in a drawer. When he reached the last envelope, he froze. The handwriting was familiar. He slid it open carefully. "Harold, I saw you on the news. It's been 31 years. I never forgot what you told me, that perfection without compassion is failure. I wanted you to know I built my life around that lesson. I'm head of applied systems now. And yesterday, when our own network failed, I used one of your old models to restore it manually. It worked. Thank you for teaching me how to see patterns and how to be human inside them." Marianne Lowe, MIT class of 92. He sat there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. He remembered her now, the student with the flawless equation and the cold certainty. She'd been brilliant, arrogant, untouchable. He'd challenged her once to find humility inside logic. She hadn't spoken to him for weeks afterward. Now, decades later, she had written this. He smiled, eyes glistening. "Good for you, Marianne," he whispered. That night, Clara called. "There's a symposium next week," she said. "They want you to speak. Themes the human mind in the age of automation." He hesitated. "I'm no speaker anymore." "You don't have to give a lecture," she said gently. "Just tell them the truth." He laughed softly. "And what truth would that be?" "That the world still needs people like you. People who remember why numbers matter." He didn't answer. The line hummed between them, a bridge of silence filled with things neither needed to say. In the following days, the attention only grew. Newspapers wrote profiles. A documentary crew asked to follow him at work. Tourists visited Union Central just to take pictures of booth number 7. The management installed a small plaque beside the window that read, "During the great system failure of 2025, Harold Finn kept the trains running by hand." He protested at first. "It's absurd," he told Mrs. Carver. "I'm not a monument." "You are to them," she said. "Let them have it." So he let it be. But fame, even gentle fame, has weight. Some passengers approached him not to travel, but to confess, to tell him how they'd lost faith in their own work, how his story reminded them to care again. Others came to ask for advice, for signatures, for pictures. A few cried. At first he listened patiently. Then he began to feel tired. Recognition, he realized, was just another form of noise, softer, but just as distracting. One evening, as the last crowd dispersed, he closed the booth and found Clara waiting by the benches. "You look exhausted," she said. "I'm old, not exhausted," he replied. "Old people rest." "You endure." He smiled faintly. "Endurance is just habit. Habits keep the world running." She sat beside him. "You ever think about going back to teaching?" He looked up at the dome, at the fading daylight turning the glass gold. "Every day. But I wouldn't know where to begin. The world speaks a new language now, shorter, faster, emptier." "Then teach them the old one," she said softly. He glanced at her. You make it sound simple. It is, you just have to start speaking. He didn't reply. But that night at home, he opened a notebook and began writing again, not equations, but reflections, thoughts about logic, empathy, and the fragile thread between them. His handwriting was slower now, less precise than in his youth, but it carried warmth. The words came easily, as if they'd been waiting years to find him again. When he finished, he realized he had filled 12 pages. He titled them Notes on Balance. The next morning, Clara found him at his booth earlier than usual, reading from the notebook. She smiled. "You're writing again." Thinking aloud, he said, "What about?" "The distance between order and kindness," he said. "It's smaller than people think." She read over his shoulder for a moment, then whispered, "You should publish this." "I'm not interested in publishing." "Then share it with me," she said. He looked at her, smiled. "You already know everything that's in here." "Then I want to hear you say it." He laughed quietly. "You have a stubborn streak. Clara, maybe I learned it from you." That week passed like a quiet ripple across the city. Journalists moved on to other stories, but the myth of the human algorithm remained. Commuters still pointed him out, but less often. The station returned to its rhythm. Yet something inside Harold was shifting again. On Friday evening, Mrs. Carver stopped by with a letter sealed in cream paper. "This came from Washington," she said. He opened it. Inside was an invitation. The National Science Foundation would like to honor Dr. Harold Finn for his lifelong contribution to applied mathematics and public service. He read it twice, then set it aside. "You're not going?" Mrs. Carver asked. "I'm still thinking." "You're allowed to be proud, you know." He smiled faintly. "Pride's just another equation. Too much of it throws everything off balance." That night, he walked through the station long after closing. The lights were dimmed, the platforms empty. He listened to the hum of the rails, the whisper of distant wind through tunnels. The air carried that faint electric smell of machinery sleeping. He thought of the years he'd spent here, the faces that passed, the voices, the small acts of grace that no one noticed. He thought of the classroom he left behind, of the blackboard that once held his entire world. And he wondered, not for the first time, if perhaps he'd simply traded one classroom for another. He sat on a bench and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, patterns began to form, grids, arcs, sequences of numbers drifting like stars. Only this time, they didn't belong to equations. They belonged to people. The woman who cried with gratitude, the boy who gave him a flower through glass, Clara's smile over morning coffee. He realized then that he had been teaching all along, not through formulas, but through presence, through patience, through the quiet example of a life lived with balance. When he opened his eyes, the first train of the midnight line pulled in, its headlights sweeping the platform. For a moment, he saw his reflection in the window, older, gentler, content. He nodded at the image, almost as if greeting an old friend. "End of the line," he murmured to himself. Or maybe the beginning. He stood, straightened his coat, and began walking toward the exit. Outside, the city glowed with the restless pulse of night, lights blinking like signals, streets crisscrossing like threads of data, every intersection alive with stories. He felt small within it, but not insignificant. The beauty of a system, he thought, was never in its scale but in its precision, the way each tiny part knew its place. And for the first time in years, Harold Finn felt that his own place, humble, quiet, and uncelebrated, was exactly right. Still, as he turned down the empty avenue, he couldn't shake one thought. Balance never stays still. It shifts, evolves, demands new equilibrium. Perhaps that was what life was, an endless recalibration between solitude and connection, between logic and love. The next morning, he would receive another call, this time from a former colleague now leading a major research program. They would ask him not just to speak, but to return, to guide, to help rebuild a bridge between human intuition and machine intelligence. And once again, Harold would have to decide, remain the anonymous guardian of order, or step back into the world he once left behind. The trains would still run either way, but the choice, as always, would define the rhythm of everything that followed. The invitation sat on his kitchen table for 3 days before he touched it again. It lay there like a small weight of possibility. A cream envelope with his name printed in precise serif letters, the kind of paper that carried the scent of ceremony and consequence. Every morning, he'd pour his coffee, sit down across from it, and read the words at the top. The National Science Foundation would like to honor Dr. Harold Finn for his lifelong contributions to applied mathematics and public service. Then he'd fold it closed again, not out of refusal, but out of thought. The world outside went about its rhythm. The newspaper still printed his story, though smaller now, tucked between politics and weather. The station had returned to its usual hum. The trains came and went. The commuters flowed like clockwork, and for the first time in weeks, no one pointed, no one asked for interviews. Fame had receded, leaving behind the quiet Harold had always loved. But still, the letter waited. On the 4th day, he brought it with him to work. It was early, before the dawn rush, when the station was still half asleep. The great hall was filled with that pale blue light that made the marble gleam like ice. He sat on the same bench near track 11 where he'd eaten his breakfast for years. Steam rose from his thermos in gentle curls. He unfolded the letter one more time and read it slowly. The words no longer felt distant. They felt like a question whispered directly to him. Would he come? Would he stand once more before the world that had forgotten him and let it remember? He ran his thumb along the edge of the paper, then smiled faintly. It wasn't pride that stirred him. It was gratitude. He had lived long enough to see his work, not for what it could earn, but for what it could teach. And maybe that was reason enough to go. When he stepped into booth number 7 that morning, Clara was already waiting outside with her usual coffee. "You look like a man who's made a decision," she said. "Perhaps I have," he replied, taking the cup. "You're going to Washington." He gave a small nod. "For one night only." She smiled. "Good. I was starting to think you'd talk yourself out of it." "I nearly did," he admitted. "But balance demands movement. Even stillness must shift or becomes decay." "That sounds like something you'd write in your notebook." He chuckled. "Perhaps it will be." The morning rush came and went, a blur of faces and footsteps. The station was running smoother than ever now, every system updated, every schedule aligned. A month had passed since the great failure, and not a single glitch had occurred. The IT department even sent Harold a thank-you card signed by the entire team. Inside, someone had drawn a little pen next to a computer and written, "We'll never underestimate handwriting again." He kept it taped to the inside wall of his booth. At noon, Mrs. Carver approached, holding a small gift box. "For your trip," she said. Inside was a new fountain pen, black lacquer with gold trim. "I can't accept this," he said. "You can," she insisted. "And you will. You've earned it." He smiled. "Thank you, Margaret. Bring it back with a story," she said. "I'll try," he replied. The train to Washington left at dusk 2 days later. As he settled into his seat, Harold looked out the window and watched the city slide by in streaks of light and shadow. He hadn't left New York in years, not since his wife had passed. The rhythm of the rails beneath him was oddly comforting, a pulse of memory. He'd once built models to describe this motion, acceleration, drag, harmonic velocity. Now he simply felt it, as if his own heart were keeping time with the engine. When the train entered open country, darkness fell like velvet over fields. The reflection of his face in the glass surprised him, older than he felt, softer somehow, as though time had finally forgiven him. He thought of all the people who had crossed his counter, all the small moments that had built the quiet geometry of his later life. A mother's thanks, a child's laugh, a stranger's kindness. They were his real theorems, he realized. Proofs written not on paper, but in gestures. The ceremony was held in a marble hall in Washington, a place filled with chandeliers and polished floors, where everyone spoke in low, precise voices. When Harold arrived, a young assistant escorted him to the front row. He recognized a few faces from long ago, older colleagues, a former department head, even Marianne Lowe, his old student. She greeted him with a warm, genuine smile. "You made it," she said. "Apparently," he replied. "They're giving you the Lifetime Award." "I suspected as much." She laughed. Still humble, I see. Still trying, he said. When the ceremony began, the moderator read a long introduction about his achievements, his publications, and the incident at Union Central. Harold listened politely but without vanity. Each word felt like it belonged to someone else, a younger man he'd once known, but no longer was. When his name was called, he stood and walked to the podium. The applause was gentle but steady. He looked out over the audience, rows of faces, some eager, some curious, some reverent. The lights above were blinding. He took a breath, rested both hands on the lectern, and began. I have not given a speech in over 20 years, he said. So if this one seems unpolished, I ask your patience. A quiet laugh rippled through the crowd. When I was a young man, he continued, I believed mathematics could solve everything. I believed that logic could fix what emotion broke, that formulas could replace judgment, that perfection was not only possible but necessary. But perfection, I have learned, is sterile. It leaves no room for mercy. He paused, letting the words settle. When our systems failed that day at the station, I saw panic in people's eyes. Fear not delay, but a helplessness. Machines had stopped, and we had forgotten how to function without them. So I did what I knew. I wrote. I calculated by hand. I trusted my own memory more than the machines. And somehow, that reminded people that order can still come from the human mind, even the aging one behind a glass window. A murmur of appreciation moved through the audience. I don't tell you this to celebrate myself, he said. I tell you because every algorithm, every code, every system we build should remember where it came from thought, from empathy, from the imperfect yet persistent human will. If we ever forget that, our machines will work perfectly and our souls will fail quietly. He looked up, scanning the faces, and saw Clara near the back of the room, smiling softly. He hadn't expected her to come, but somehow he wasn't surprised. In mathematics, he said, we often speak of balance, the point where forces meet and neither dominates. I used to think balance was something you found and held on to, but now I know it's something you create every day, between logic and kindness, between silence and speech, between staying and moving on. He closed a notebook he'd brought, though he hadn't written a single word in it. I thank you for this honor, he said. But if you remember me, don't remember the man who solved equations. Remember the man who still believed they could serve people. The hall was silent for a heartbeat, and then applause rose. Soft at first, then swelling until it filled the air. He bowed his head slightly, not in pride but in gratitude. After the ceremony, Mary Ann and Clara joined him outside beneath the dim glow of the street lamps. The air smelled faintly of rain and cherry blossoms. Washington at night had a solemn kind of beauty. Everything important felt quieter. You haven't lost your touch, Mary Ann said. I've only lost my hair, Harold replied, and they all laughed. Clara handed him the gold medal they'd given him, still in its velvet case. What will you do with it? She asked. Put it somewhere it won't gather dust, he said, though he already knew he'd tuck it into the drawer beside his pens and letters, among the things that mattered but never needed display. They walked together for a while along the reflecting pool. The water was still, mirroring the night sky. Clara walked slightly ahead, her silhouette bright against the glow. Harold slowed, watching her. She reminded him of every student he'd ever hoped would surpass him. Curious, compassionate, unafraid of the unknown. He felt something like peace settle over him, light as mist. The next morning, he took an early train back home. The ride was quiet. He opened his notebook and wrote only one sentence. Every system, no matter how complex, requires a human constant. Then he closed it again. When he returned to Union Central, the station greeted him like an old friend. The echo of announcements, the glint of light on the rails, the faint smell of metal and coffee. He walked to the concourse slowly, as though rediscovering each detail. At booth number 7, someone had placed a small bouquet of daisies with a note. Thank you for reminding us that not everything needs a password. He smiled and set the flowers aside. For the rest of the day, he worked as he always had, methodically, quietly, with the precision of habit and the ease of long practice. But there was a softness in him now, a warmth he didn't try to hide. When a young clerk struggled with the ticketing software, Harold stepped over, showed her the pattern, and said, "See? Once you understand the logic, you'll never fear the blank screen." By evening, the crowd thinned. He sat back, stretching his hands. The gold pen gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light. For a moment, he simply listened to the hum of electricity, the murmur of trains, the steady rhythm of life in motion. Everything was in balance. He closed his ledger, turned off the terminal, and stepped outside into the fading light. The sky was streaked with pink and gray, the kind of color that belonged neither to day nor night. He stood on the steps, breathing it in. The world was still moving, still imperfect, still beautiful. Clara met him there, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word. "Do you ever get tired of this view?" she asked. "Never," he said. "It changes every day, even when it looks the same." They watched the trains pull out one by one, their lights fading into the horizon. The station clock chimed 6, then 7, marking time like a metronome for all the stories still unfolding within its walls. "You could retire, you know," Clara said. "Lie by the sea. Write your book." He smiled. "Retirement is just another word for imbalance. I'll stop when the numbers stop adding up." She laughed softly. "They always will, won't they?" "Until the end," he said. The wind stirred, carrying the faint echo of a train whistle. The lights flickered on, bathing the platform in soft gold. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to explain. When the last train of the evening rolled in, Harold watched the passengers step aboard. Strangers heading toward destinations he would never know. Yet he felt connected to each of them, as if some invisible equation bound them all. Movement and rest, order and chance, beginnings and endings. It was all the same formula, infinite and unbroken. He turned to Clara. "You know," he said quietly, "people think mathematics is about numbers. It's not. It's about relationships. Between things, between choices, between people. The trick is to keep the equation alive." She nodded. "And you have." He smiled, watching the train disappear into the night. "For now," he said. The platform fell silent again. The city breathed, the clock ticked, the lights hummed. Harold slipped the gold pen into his pocket, felt its weight. Not heavy, not light, just balanced. He began walking home, his steps unhurried, his coat brushing softly against the breeze. Somewhere behind him, the station continued its endless rhythm, a living testament to both progress and patience. As he crossed the street, he looked back one last time. The grand facade of Union Central shimmered beneath the lamps, every window glowing like a cell in a vast equation. And at the center of it all, booth number 7 waited, quiet, steady, eternal. Harold smiled to himself. "Everything adds up," he whispered. And with that, he turned away, disappearing into the gentle night, an old mathematician walking toward peace, leaving behind a world that, for a brief and shining moment, had remembered how beautiful it was to think.